When you travel to York, if you travel by rail, one of the main walkways into the inner city walls is via the main station road and the Lendal Bridge. Just before you go under the main walls, almost like a guard at the gate, there is a statue. This is George Leeman, and he was just as important to the railways as the railways were to York. George was a local lad and was born in York in 1809. His father was a greengrocer, but made enough of a wage to pay to send his son to school. Upon completion, he'd taken in as apprentice for a law firm in the city. In 1835, Leeman completed his training and qualified as a solicitor. He wasted no time in setting up a new law firm covering the majority of the city and the town of Beverley. It was around the same time that he took on his apprenticeship that a young gentleman, not too much older than Leeman, began to make political waves that he just couldn't ignore. George Hudson had grown tired of making no name for himself from his draper's shop he had inherited from his wife's dowry, and wanted to aspire to become so much more. A devout Tory, Hudson was determined to take a seat in York. But York had been a steadfast Whig stronghold for many, many years, and few saw any way through that political wall. It wasn't important on the grand scheme of things, with the Tories putting up their chances and money into areas that were more likely to swing to their cause. But George knew that York was going to be important. Sitting pretty much halfway between London and Edinburgh, he knew that securing the city was paramount to controlling the rail network that was growing around him. The first political battle had, as expected, ended in defeat, but George had made waves with his enthusiasm and a few upper-class friends to boot. In 1833, thanks to an inheritance he managed to gain, he used some of the money to form the York Union Bank, and the sudden death of two MPs caused a by-election, and although once again his party lost, his support of the Tory candidate and the excellent way he put together his campaign really started to get the people to rally behind him. In the same year, Hudson accepted the post of Treasurer for the Railway Committee with a view to connect to York. For Hudson, this was the chance he needed and what he was banking on. In less than 3 years, the York and North Midland Railway was born. Hudson was promoted to chairman thanks to his hard work and drive. This promotion benefited him greatly. Not only was he in the upper class of elite men in the city, he was able to work his charm on the city council. He pushed benevolent acts of charity on the people in order to win favour, and it worked. In 1837, his party's work caused the Whig defences to crumble, and the city that was declared impregnable by Whig territory fell to the Tories. The Tories felt that there was no better man to lead them than Hudson, and he was declared Lord Mayor of York the same year. George Leeman was seething at the news. He couldn't believe that this nobody had come in and turned the local political world on its head. George was generous and keen to stay in favour with those in power, so he held lavish feasts in the mansion house, even inviting the locals to come in and dine with him. Leeman wasn't buying it, but unlike other Whigs, he kept rather quiet and grumbled on the sidelines. Hudson, in his first tenure, was rather popular and concentrated efforts to get the railway up and running. His goal was popularity, and his motive was to stay in power as long as he could. He used any excuse to hold galas and events for the populace. He was made the chairman of the York Union Gaslight Company in preparation for the illumination for the banquet for 14,000 people for the Queen's coronation. Needless to say that when the local elections came about, the Tories swept the boards. The Whigs used every loophole they could to stop Hudson's second term, but nothing was going to stop him. In 1839, to much fanfare, the York and North Midland Railway opened, but Hudson had little opportunity to savour in his victory. It was now that Leeman had chosen to strike. Leeman knew that Hudson's second tenure was ending and launched a scathing propaganda attack against the whole Tory party, accusing them of bowing down before the golden calf of Hudson's wealth and worshipping it. Being the devout religious folk the populace was at the time, this insult was seen as serious as the modern-day public scandals. George responded to his critics, calling them ingrates who touted for free invites to his elaborate affairs. But in secret he was confused. He had brought the railways to York. He had made York the second most important city in England, next to London. Why were they so angry with him? He had so many achievements and used them as his shield against those that stood against him. Even though George was no longer Lord Mayor, he had used the position to help his railway, and the next few years he went from strength to strength. York had many new lines thanks to Hudson, but every new line opened and glory posted on him enraged Leeman. George Leeman had made it clear of his loathing for the railway king. He would openly write about the Magnet of Monkgate, but in 1841 Hudson wanted to build a new bridge at Lendal to improve the access to the station. Leeman led the objectors. He was not averse to a new bridge, as it was the only way to cross at that point was by ferry, but he wanted the railway to also provide a brand new road from the station to Micklegate, and took the fight to Parliament. Hudson hated being dictated to, and the two fought for years. The bridge did get built nearly 20 years after the plans began. The next 6 years was a whirlwind for George Hudson. His grip on the railways tightened, and even went to London to take on the political kings and to bring his railway. But when in 1846 the Tories in York asked Hudson to serve a third term as mayor, Leeman, who had been quietly working at his solicitor's firm, saw the perfect opportunity to finally bring the king to his knees. Hudson returned home to a hero's welcome, but some questioned if he was biting off more than he could chew. He was MP for Sunderland, the head of several railway companies, and now Lord Mayor. But Hudson assured them he could cope. He wanted to revitalise his bridge plans and hoped Leeman would keep quiet. At first, the financing of the bridge would be a joint venture between the York Council and the York and North Midland Railway. However, when the project was read out of Parliament, the railway's contribution was missing. Leeman was enraged. This was Hudson's idea, and he should jolly well pay for it. Hudson backed off and agreed he would pay for the costings. But the papers were not too happy with Leeman either. His constant attacks were wearing thin, and the press were getting sick of it. But in 1848, a simple pamphlet was issued that would be the turning point. The pamphlet, called The Bubble of the Ages, accused Hudson of paying its shareholders from capital rather from profit. Its allegations sent shockwaves through the shareholders, and Hudson was forced to go public. It also didn't help that he'd negotiated a deal with a rival railway that included the running rights of York and North Midland lines. Hudson was forced to fight off the shareholders in general meetings, and the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway, unsure why their dividend had dropped to just 6% and the pamphlet's allegations, caused them to set up an investigation committee. Along with them was the Eastern Counties investigation, and as a lawyer, Leeman was only too happy to offer his services and help in the investigation. What they found was damning. George had indeed used capital instead of revenue to pay dividends, but he had overinflated it. In 1846, Hudson, as chairman, had convinced the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway to purchase shares in the Great North of England Railway, and the railway agreed, putting Hudson in charge of purchasing the shares. What the unsuspecting railway hadn't counted on was that George had already purchased the shares on the Great North of England Railway himself as a sole trader. He was only entitled to 900. However, he had managed to rake in over 10,000 shares and had purchased them at £21 each. In a move that would make most criminals proud, he did buy the shares for the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway. He sold everyone he owned to them at inflated prices. There were shares he appropriated in the Sunderland Dock Company, and despite being paid substantial dividends, he had never paid for them. £26,000 was given to Hudson in order to purchase shares on behalf of another railway, and that was sat as his bank account as well as a £30,000 payment for land purchases. Accounts were falsified to hide Hudson's dealings, and Hudson had even had the gall to sell his own rails between two of his own railway companies, inflate the price, and rake in a profit to the tune of £38,500. There was unknown expenses run through Parliament costing £7,600, When the MPs were questioned, the only explanation that was plausible was a possible bribe. It wouldn't be out of the realm, as many MPs were wealthy landowners and were major railway backers in their own right. As each page of the report were turned, the worse it became for Hudson. In the April of 1849, his own York and North Midland Railway brought up their own report. In it, they revealed their own overinflated prices, and the report forced Hudson to prepay £30,000. It was the first of several repayments he was forced to make. By the end of the year, Hudson had repayment debts amounting to £750,000, and that's not accounting for today's inflation. Hudson resigned from the York, Newcastle and Berwick Railway, and thanks to his investigations, the railway invited George Leeman to be chairman. Leeman accepted, and the first thing he did was ask for repayment or take Hudson to court. Knowing Leeman wasn't a man for messing about, Hudson was forced to sell his beloved country home to appease him and give the railway back £200,000 from its proceeds. But Leeman knew his work wasn't done. Hudson had left a broken railway company, a sour taste for investors, coupled with decreased passenger and freight numbers. This was going to be really difficult to turn around. The railway had a huge hole in its finances, including money which was earmarked to purchase the GNER. But Leeman was able to broker a deal that will allow the merger to take place that wouldn't bankrupt the company. Through careful financing, he was able to create the North Eastern Railway Company and becoming deputy chairman in 1855. In 1853, Leeman was offered the term of Lord Mayor of York. He accepted it graciously. During his tenure, he pushed to assure York's historical architecture was protected and was keen to restore and preserve as much of the city's walls as possible. He was a popular mayor, albeit a bit more frugal than Hudson. The North Eastern Railway was everything that Hudson was attempting to achieve. Its beating heart was York Station and headquarters, and it covered over 4,000 miles of track and was the first railway to employ a permanent architect. It was needed too, as the North Eastern Railway had outgrown its inner walled station and was planning a much grander affair. George Leeman conceded his mayorship a year later, but won it back in 1860. Like many, he shifted his gaze to other companies and other industries. He was the chairman of the Yorkshire Banking Company and heavily invested in the Teesside Steel Works and Rosedale Ferryhill Iron Company from 1860 to 1877. Very much like Hudson, he was drawn to Parliament. His Whig Party had dissolved in 1859, with the majority of the party joining the Liberal Party, an amalgamation of various parties to fight the Tories. There was only one constituency Leeman wanted: York. In 1865 he got his wish and represented York at the highest place in the land. He held the role for a year. However, in 1871 he regained his position and would hold his seat for 9 more years. In 1870, Leeman won his third tenure as York Mayor, being only the second man to ever do so. But this was his last mayorship. He took on the role as North Eastern Railway Chairman in 1874 and the Rail Companies Association, a company dedicated to protect investments, shareholders and, more importantly, from those in Parliament. But by 1880, Leeman was feeling tired. His iron company failed, and not wanting to create any disruption as his personal wealth had decreased, he resigned from the role as chairman. He was also feeling his age and feeling rather unwell. His resignation was graciously accepted, and he had a welcome seat on the board for life. Leeman passed away in Scarborough in 1882, and he was greatly mourned. He is buried in York Cemetery, and in 1885 he was honoured by the people of York with a statue looking towards York Station. The statue, designed by George Walker Kilburn, is perfectly situated. It sat beside the old station, overlooked the new, and sat outside the very walls he helped preserve. Hudson may have started the work, but it was Leeman's vision that finished it. His statue still stands proud next to the road that bears his name. Leeman's legacy would live on, however. One of his children, Joseph, would take on his father's seat in York, and the North Eastern Railway would grow. and eventually merged to become part of the Big Forequarter in the 1920s and be a household name. So, if you're in York, please pay your respects to Leeman, York's other railway king.